Imagine waking up in the bustling city of Ur around 2000 BCE. The sun is rising over mud brick rooftops, and the air is already thick with the smell of clay, livestock, and the distant smoke of cooking fires. You're not scrolling through your phone. There is no phone. But if you're lucky, you might get your hands on a freshly baked barley loaf or exchange gossip at the local ziggurat. Welcome to ancient Sumer, one of the very first civilizations humanity ever built. At first glance, life in Sumer seems simple, primitive even, but the truth is far more fascinating. These people had cities with streets, schools, courts, and a functioning economy with a surprisingly detailed system of trade. They had scribes who could read and write, priests who mediated divine matters, and merchants who shipped goods across rivers and deserts. They had taxes, they had laws, they even had receipts. And, perhaps most importantly for this story, they had complaints. You see, the Sumerians were pioneers in many things: irrigation, law codes, beer recipes. But they were also pioneers in something much more relatable: grumbling about bad service. They didn't have Yelp, but they had clay tablets. And when a Sumerian had something to say, they didn't shout it into the void. They wrote it down. This might sound trivial, but it's actually incredible. Thousands of years ago, these people didn't just endure their frustrations in silence. They took the time, sometimes hours, maybe even days, to carve their complaints into clay, one wedge-shaped mark at a time, using a stylus made of reed. These weren't angry tweets or passive-aggressive post-it notes. These were messages meant to last forever, hardened by fire, buried by time, and rediscovered by archaeologists. So why does this matter? Because it reminds us that the impulse to complain, to be disappointed, to demand better, it's not a modern thing. It's human. Deeply, wonderfully, annoyingly human. You've been burned by a product? So were they. You've waited too long for a delivery? So did they. You think customer service today is bad? Try getting your copper delivered by donkey across a desert. But there's something oddly beautiful about it. Complaints in the hands of the Sumerians were more than venting. They were statements of principle, a form of civic responsibility, a way to hold someone accountable, not just for the sake of justice, but for the health of a society trying to stay afloat amid chaos and trade routes. And that's what this story is about. We're going to take a gentle stroll through some of the oldest known complaint letters in human history, messages written in cuneiform, the script of the ancient Sumerians. We'll meet angry merchants, careless deliverymen, and customers who were, quite frankly, done putting up with nonsense. We'll learn how these early Mesopotamians turned their frustrations into formal, poetic, sometimes passive-aggressive clay-based documentation. And maybe, just maybe, you'll fall asleep tonight knowing that even 4,000 years ago, someone was out there furiously etching into a lump of wet clay. This is unacceptable. Because when we say nothing is new under the sun, that includes bad business practices. Welcome to the oldest customer service drama on Earth. Let's be honest. When we think of complaints today, we picture impatient customers tapping on smartphones, demanding refunds for lukewarm coffee or bad Wi-Fi. But in 2000 BCE, the stakes were different. Less about lattes, more about survival, status, and the fragile balance of trust in a growing civilization. So, what did a complaint actually mean in the world of ancient Sumer? To begin with, there was no casual venting. No late-night rants on social media, no customer hotline to call. A complaint in ancient Mesopotamia wasn't just an emotional outburst, it was a serious act. Filing a complaint meant something had truly gone wrong in the fabric of business, law, or social order. And because resources were scarce and trade relationships delicate, complaints were handled with a surprising level of formality. In a society where everything was recorded on clay, even your dissatisfaction had to be properly documented. But you couldn't just scribble a few angry words and be done with it. Writing meant going to a scribe, someone trained in the art of cuneiform. These scribes weren't emotional translators. They were precise, almost clinical. Your fury had to be converted into formal, stylized language, etched onto a tablet that might outlive you by thousands of years. The fact that people still went through all that trouble tells us something important. Complaints were not only acceptable, they were expected. In a way, to complain was to participate in the legal and moral framework of your city. It was how you defended your name, asserted your rights, and ensured the rules were being followed. In some cases, not complaining might even have been seen as weakness, or worse, acceptance of injustice. But don't confuse these clay tablet complaints with legal cases filed in court. They didn't always result in a trial or punishment. Often they served as a kind of written pressure, a social and economic signal sent across the community. You could imagine it as a pre-Twitter public statement, except it took an hour to write and weeks to dry. The topics of complaint ranged widely. Some were economic: bad shipments of copper, unfair prices, delayed payments. Others were personal: disputes over property lines, accusations of theft, or grievances about someone's behavior. In all of them, there was a common thread: a desire for justice and a belief that the system should be fair. If not now, then eventually. Take, for example, the infamous tablet written by a man named Nani to the merchant Ea Nasir. Nani didn't just vent, he detailed how he was given subpar copper, how his servant was treated disrespectfully, and how Ea Nasir failed to uphold the terms of their agreement. This wasn't a tantrum, it was a structured argument, a plea for accountability. In fact, it reads less like a complaint and more like a press release with teeth. Reading these ancient documents today is both amusing and sobering. We chuckle at how familiar the tone can be. You did not do what you promised. But beneath that, there's something deeply human: the need to be heard, to be taken seriously, to make things right. 4,000 years may have passed, but the emotional architecture of a complaint remains strikingly intact. Interestingly, complaints were also used to establish a kind of personal brand. If you were a merchant and someone wronged you, making your grievance public was a way to say, "I am not a fool and I expect honest dealings." In doing so, you protected your reputation and reminded others that trust was currency. In a marketplace without credit cards, Yelp reviews, or return policies, your word and your reaction was everything. There's also a poetic irony in how permanent these complaints became. Unlike today's deleted tweets or forgotten emails, these messages were carved in stone. Well, clay, but close enough. They've survived wars, floods, and millennia of silence. And now they tell us stories not of kings or gods, but of ordinary people who were tired of being mistreated. So, what counted as a complaint in 2000 BCE? It wasn't whining. It wasn't venting. It was a declaration. A complaint was your voice chiseled into time, your version of events offered up to the gods, your community, and to us, the accidental readers, 4,000 years later. It was proof that even in one of the earliest human societies, people already knew something we're still figuring out today. Silence doesn't fix injustice. And sometimes, writing it down is the first step toward making things right. In the end, whether it's a clay tablet or a one-star review, a complaint is never just noise. It's a signal. And in ancient Sumer, that signal was shaped by reed, pressed into mud, and fired into memory. If you've ever filled out an online complaint form, clicking tiny boxes with increasing frustration, you've already experienced a pale digital echo of something ancient, something baked, literally, into history. Because long before email or customer service hotlines, long before typewriters or parchment, there were clay tablets. And in the world of ancient Sumer, clay wasn't just something you used to make bricks. It was a medium of memory, accountability, and, yes, dissatisfaction. To understand how people complained in 2000 BCE, you first have to understand the physical process of writing. There was no ink, no paper, no ballpoint pens. The Sumerians invented a script called cuneiform, wedge-shaped marks pressed into soft clay using a stylus carved from reed. This stylus wasn't glamorous. It looked like a fat stick, but to a Sumerian scribe, it was power incarnate. With it, they could record laws, stories, prayers, and the occasional glorious rant. Now imagine this. You're angry. Someone sold you inferior copper. Or maybe your neighbor moved his fence 2 cubits into your field. You want justice. What do? You don't shout. You don't brawl. You go to a scribe, you pay him, because scribes weren't volunteers, and you dictate your grievance. Carefully, precisely, your complaint is translated into formal cuneiform, pressed onto a tablet of soft clay, smoothed by hand and edge. And then the waiting begins. Because these tablets had to dry, either in the sun or in kilns. Some were left to harden naturally, others intentionally baked to preserve the message permanently. A dried tablet could last decades. A baked one? Millennia. Which is why we're still reading them now, long after the people who wrote them turned to dust. It's not just history. It's preserved emotion, fossilized bureaucracy, a glimpse of frustration made eternal. These tablets varied in size. Some were small enough to fit in a palm, like a post-it note of the Bronze Age. Others were larger and heavier, like a paperback book made of rock. And they were stored, cataloged. Sometimes sealed in clay envelopes. Yes, envelopes made of more clay, that had to be broken open to read. It's difficult not to smile at the sheer drama of it. A sealed complaint, wrapped in its own ceramic packaging, ready to be shattered open in pursuit of truth. But these weren't just throwaway notes. Writing was sacred labor. Each mark took time and intent. Even the angriest complaint had to pass through layers of ritual, from speaker to scribe, from stylus to clay, from drying to delivery. It was a kind of slow-motion confrontation, a demand that your words be taken seriously enough to last. And that's the thing. People didn't write to feel better. They wrote to be heard, to be remembered. In an oral society where most people couldn't read or write, putting something into clay was like casting it in stone. It made your story real, official, impossible to ignore. You could try to deny an argument shouted in a marketplace, but a baked tablet? That was evidence. That was weight. And these complaints weren't always private. Many were placed in temples, archives, or delivered directly to the parties involved. Some may have even been displayed in public as warnings or public shaming, ancient versions of "beware, bad service here." They became part of the social current, shaping reputation, encouraging accountability. A clay tablet could travel further than a voice, and it could last longer than memory. What's especially striking is how personal many of them feel. Even through the haze of time and translation, you can sense the tone. Frustration laced with formality. Disappointment buried under etiquette. They weren't ranting, they were asserting. These were people who believed in the system, who believed that writing their complaint down, literally carving it into the world, could make a difference. There's something deeply poetic about that, because while today's complaints often disappear into inboxes or vanish with the click of delete, the Sumerian version was a physical artifact. You could hold it, feel the weight, smell the baked earth. It was a message that outlasted the moment, a time capsule of friction, integrity, and the simple, ancient desire to say, "This isn't right." And so, the next time you fill out a complaint form and wonder if anyone will ever read it, just remember, in Sumer, they didn't just read complaints, they preserved them forever. If you're imagining ancient Sumer as a quiet land of farmers and priests humming along peacefully with little need for complaints or reviews, you're missing the whole picture. Because nestled among their ziggurats and canals, the Sumerians were also fiercely active traders. And trade, as we all know, is messy. It involves trust, risk, reputation, and sometimes disappointment. Enter the karum, one of the most fascinating and overlooked pieces of ancient commercial infrastructure. It wasn't just a marketplace. It was a network, a hub, and in some ways, the closest thing the Sumerians had to Yelp. The word karum originally referred to a dock or harbor area, but its meaning quickly expanded. In many Sumerian and later Assyrian cities, the karum became a commercial district, a place where merchants from different regions came to do business. But more than just a physical space, the karum evolved into a trading institution, a collective of merchants who regulated themselves, set rules, resolved disputes, and importantly, kept tabs on who was trustworthy and who wasn't. This was critical in a world without banks, without contracts as we know them, and without any real central enforcement. When merchants journeyed across deserts and rivers with carts full of goods, they needed some way to know whether the person they were dealing with on the other end was legitimate. That's where the karum stepped in. It wasn't an app, obviously, but it did function like a slow, dusty, cuneiform-powered rating system. Let's say you were a merchant arriving in the great city of Ur. You brought copper, lapis lazuli, or wool, and you wanted to trade for grain, beer, or textiles. You'd likely head to the karum, where trade was concentrated. But before making deals, you'd ask around. What about this guy Ian Asir? Does he pay on time? Are his goods pure? Has anyone filed a complaint against him? The answers would matter. Word traveled. And if someone had a reputation for cheating customers or cutting corners, that reputation would follow them. In some cases, it would be carved into a clay tablet, forever branding them as unreliable. The karum didn't just regulate trade, It preserved stories. It remembered who kept their promises and who didn't. It was the collective memory of Mesopotamian commerce. These networks weren't just informal gossip clubs. There is evidence that some kurum operated with real structure. Merchant councils, established routes, even shared risks on long-distance trade. They functioned almost like proto-corporations, but without logos or shareholders. What held them together was trust, shared interest, and mutual accountability. And the complaints? Those were the glue, the quiet hum of review and feedback that kept the system honest, or at least tried to. What's especially interesting is how complaints interacted with this structure. In modern terms, a complaint is often seen as a private transaction, a message between you and the company. But in Sumer, a complaint was public. A clay tablet wasn't a whisper. It was a signpost. If someone at the kurum got a reputation for dishonesty, it didn't just affect them. It shook the trust in the whole network. So people complained not just for themselves, but for the integrity of the trade itself. It's also worth noting that the Sumerians had no formal police force overseeing commerce. The gods were watching, yes, but so were your peers. The fear of divine punishment might have kept your soul in check, but it was the collective opinion of the kurum that protected your livelihood. That's why being mentioned in a complaint, especially one that got recorded, was more than just embarrassing. It could be economically devastating. So in a strange way, the kurum was both courtroom and cafe. It was where deals were made, but also where people exchanged stories, warnings, and praise. It had no star rating system, no review counts, no upvotes, but it did have memory. And in a society where memory was written into clay, that meant something. When we think about how far we've come with digital platforms, real-time feedback, and algorithm-driven trust scores, it's easy to forget that the core idea isn't new. Thousands of years ago, traders in ancient cities were already trying to answer the same questions we ask today. Can I trust this person? Will I get what I paid for? If something goes wrong, who will listen? The kurum didn't have flashy interfaces or push notifications, but it worked because people made it work. Through conversation, through writing, and through an unspoken agreement that trust matters, that honesty matters, and that even in the dust and noise of the world's first cities, someone, somewhere, was always watching and remembering. So the next time you scroll through reviews before booking a hotel or ordering takeout, just think, you're not doing anything new. You're participating in a tradition as old as civilization itself. And in some ancient city, under the shadow of a ziggurat, a merchant once whispered to another, "I wouldn't trade with him." I've heard things. That whisper might have echoed all the way onto clay. Welcome to the kurum, where reputation was currency, and every complaint was a line carved into the history of trade. It's easy to think of the ancient world as brutally direct, swords, conquests, proclamations carved in stone. But if you dig just a little deeper, especially into the everyday life of the Sumerians, you'll discover something delightfully familiar: the quiet, simmering magic of passive aggression. And yes, they managed to channel it into cuneiform, one wedge-shaped mark at a time. To complain in ancient Sumer wasn't to shout. It wasn't to insult. It was to master a tone that said, "I'm not mad, just profoundly, spiritually disappointed." Imagine a culture where every grievance had to go through a professional scribe, be translated into stylized, legal-sounding phrases, and then pressed into clay to be possibly archived for centuries. You don't do that with rage. You do that with icy precision. That's where the art begins. Take the most famous example, the complaint letter from a man named Nani to a copper merchant named Ea-Nasir. It's often celebrated as the world's oldest customer complaint. And not just because it's old, but because it's so perfectly written in the tone of someone who has been wronged and knows exactly how to make the other person feel it. Without raising a voice, without using a single curse word, Nani manages to slice through Ea-Nasir's reputation like a dull piece of copper through hot butter. He writes that he came in good faith. He expected quality. He was not only given inferior copper, but treated rudely by the merchant's staff. The phrasing is meticulous, bordering on polite, and that's what makes it sting. The letter is full of phrases like, "You did not do what you promised," and "This is not what we agreed upon," each one a tiny dagger wrapped in formality. He doesn't need exclamation points. The quiet authority of clay will do the work. It's not a tantrum, It's a strategy. When you read these tablets closely, you realize that passive aggression wasn't just an emotional style, it was a social survival skill. The Sumerians lived in cities where alliances, trade, and reputation mattered. Losing your temper publicly could backfire, but a well-written complaint, one that oozed controlled indignation, could do more damage than any insult. This style of writing also carried a specific cultural weight. The Sumerians were deeply hierarchical, and language reflected that. Even when someone was upset, they rarely dropped the formalities. They addressed people by name and title. They stated the facts before feelings. It was as if the structure of their complaint was part of the punishment, making the accused sit through a perfectly crafted argument that pointed out in slow, deliberate wedges just how badly they had failed. It's kind of brilliant, honestly, because when you strip away the time and the format, you're left with something incredibly human. The urge to make someone feel how wrong they've been, not through shouting, but through sharp, deliberate calmness. We see it today in customer emails that start with, "I'm just confused why," or "per my last message." That same energy is baked into the clay of Sumerian complaint tablets. Timeless disapproval, elegantly phrased. And let's not ignore the physicality of it. Writing in cuneiform wasn't fast. Each symbol had to be pressed into the clay with intention. It gave the writer time to cool down, to choose words carefully. That's probably why so many of these complaints feel like they've been simmering for a while, boiled down into something concentrated and potent. You can almost hear the writer thinking, "I'll make this hurt, but I'll make it proper." It's worth noting that many of these tablets weren't just sent to the person being complained about. They were public, or semi-public, placed in temples, read aloud in gatherings, or archived in collections that others could access. Which means that writing in a passive-aggressive tone was also about saving face. You couldn't come off as petty. You had to sound reasonable, measured, disappointed, but never defeated. This might be one of the earliest forms of reputation management. You present your case with calm dignity. You let the facts speak for themselves. And in doing so, you signal not only that you were wronged, but that you are above the kind of behavior you're criticizing. You're better. That's the heart of passive aggression, not just to highlight the offense, but to showcase your own restraint. There's a strange comfort in realizing that even in the earliest cities, with their markets and mud brick homes, people were already playing these subtle games of tone and implication. We often think modern life invented all the complex ways to say, "I'm disappointed in you," without actually saying it. But the Sumerians were doing it before the alphabet even existed. So next time you hesitate before hitting send on a carefully worded email that ends with, "Looking forward to your prompt reply," just remember, you're part of a long, noble tradition. One that goes all the way back to a man named Nani, sitting with a scribe, watching as his frustrations were gently carved into clay. Not with fury, but with style. His name was Nani. And no, he wasn't a king or a general or a priest channeling divine prophecies. He was something arguably more powerful in the grand tapestry of human history, a dissatisfied customer. Around 3,750 years ago, in the thriving city of Ur, Nani sat down with a professional scribe and dictated a complaint that would echo through millennia. That clay tablet, baked and buried by time, would eventually be dug up and read aloud by scholars in lab coats, chuckling softly at just how little has changed in the human experience. The story begins with copper. Back then, copper was a big deal. It was used for tools, weapons, ornaments, basically the backbone of the Bronze Age. And because copper wasn't always locally available, it had to be traded over long distances. That meant merchants. That meant logistics. That meant problems. Enter Ea Nasir. Ea Nasir was a merchant dealing in copper ingots. He was also, if Nani's letter is to be believed, not particularly good at his job, or at least not good at meeting customer expectations. We know this because Nani went to extraordinary lengths to say so. In a time when writing was still an elite skill and every tablet cost time and money to produce, Nani had his complaint etched into clay. It wasn't just a grumble, it was a formal grievance. The tablet is small, fits in the palm of your hand, but it's dense with frustration. In it, Nani accuses Ea Nasir of delivering inferior copper, failing to honor agreements, and insulting his messenger. The tone is one of professional fury, Disappointed, incredulous, and laced with the unmistakable undertone of, "I can't believe I have to say this." But say it he did. He writes that he traveled through enemy territory to make this deal, that he came in good faith, that he expected a certain standard. And what did he get in return? Bad copper and bad manners. The letter isn't just about metal, it's about dignity, about being treated with respect in a world where every journey was dangerous and every deal a matter of trust. It's not hard to imagine the scene. Nani, perhaps red-faced, pacing in a small room, dictating his frustrations to a tired scribe who's already etched 5 similar complaints that week. The scribe dips his stylus into the clay, carefully pressing each wedge-shaped symbol. This wasn't a quick email. It was slow, deliberate, permanent. You didn't write unless you meant it, and Nani meant it. He doesn't threaten Yanasir. He doesn't curse him, but he does something more devastating. He outlines, in detail, just how badly Yanasir has failed. It's the world's first recorded version of "I'm not mad, just disappointed," and it hits just as hard now as it probably did then. The fact that Nani chose to document it speaks volumes. He wanted this on the record. He wanted others to know. In a time without Twitter threads or Yelp reviews, he used clay to spread his truth. What makes this tablet even more remarkable is what it reveals about the Sumerians themselves. It wasn't just that complaints were allowed, they were institutionalized. You could formally accuse someone of poor service, and it mattered. These tablets were often submitted to merchant councils or temple officials. They weren't idle notes, they were part of a system of accountability. In a way, Nani was doing what we all do today when we leave a 1-star review. Not because we think the company will collapse under the weight of our disapproval, but because we want someone, anyone, to know this wasn't okay. And here's where things get really interesting. We don't have Yanasir's reply. Maybe he ignored it. Maybe he wrote back and the tablet didn't survive. Maybe he just rolled his eyes and moved on. But history didn't forget him. Thanks to Nani's complaint, Yanasir is now one of the most infamous merchants in human history. His name is taught in classrooms, analyzed in research papers, and occasionally memed on the internet, all because he sold bad copper to the wrong guy. There's a strange sort of justice in that. Not the kind that comes from punishment, but the kind that comes from being remembered, for better or worse. Yanasir has become a symbol, not just of ancient trade, but of the timelessness of bad service. And Nani? He became the quiet hero of frustrated customers everywhere. A voice across time, reminding us that standing up for yourself is not a modern invention, it's a legacy. So when we ask, who wrote the first known customer complaint? The answer is simple, a man named Nani, but the real answer is a little deeper. It was all of us. Every time we've spoken up, written down, or carved our dissatisfaction into the nearest available surface, we've echoed what he started. A universal human moment, expecting better, demanding better. And in Nani's case, doing it with style, precision, and a clay tablet that would outlive empires. The burn letter to Yanasir. Of all the messages carved into clay across the dusty cities of ancient Mesopotamia, few have survived with as much personality as the one sent from Nani to the copper merchant Yanasir. This wasn't just a transactional note or a casual complaint. It was a burn letter, ancient edition, crafted with care, dipped in disappointment, and fired into permanence. It's the oldest known customer complaint we have, and it's still spicy after nearly 4,000 years. At first glance, the letter feels almost amusing in its structure. Nani doesn't scream, he doesn't insult, he doesn't demand vengeance from the gods. Instead, he delivers a surgical dissection of how exactly, and in how many ways, Yanasir has failed to live up to his word. In what might be the most passive-aggressive mic drop in Bronze Age history, Nani tells him, "You are not what you promised." Let's pause on that line. You are not what you promised. It could be a breakup text, a parent's quiet scolding, a manager's final performance review. It could be carved into a clay tablet or typed into a Slack message. But no matter the format, the sentiment lands the same. It is cold, pointed, and devastating. Nani isn't just talking about bad copper. He's talking about trust, about dignity, about being let down in a world where doing what you say you'll do was one of the only currencies that mattered. The story, as we know it, goes like this. Nani arranged for a shipment of copper from Yanasir. Somewhere along the line, things went wrong. The quality of the copper was poor. The staff who received Nani's representatives were rude. The goods weren't delivered to the expected location. The transaction was, in modern terms, a total mess. But instead of yelling, Nani sat down, composed himself, and dictated a letter with the precision of a disappointed CEO. It opens with the facts. Nani outlines what was agreed upon. He reminds Ea-Nasir of their prior dealings. He notes, calmly but with undeniable irritation, that he has already paid the money. Then he moves to the betrayal, how the copper was substandard, how his servant was mistreated, and how the merchant has not responded to his concerns. Each sentence adds another layer of quiet rage. There's no sarcasm, no exclamation marks, no capital letters, just control. Discipline. The kind of measured anger that's far more unnerving than shouting. By the time Nani tells Ea-Nasir that he will not accept copper from him again unless it meets the promised quality, the warning is clear. This isn't just a complaint, it's a line in the sand. What makes the tablet even more compelling is the cultural backdrop. In ancient Mesopotamia, your word was everything. Contracts were rare, paper didn't exist, reputation, not paperwork, held business together. So when Nani accuses Ea-Nasir of breaking his word, it's more than a personal slight. It's a statement with public, even spiritual weight. It implies that Ea-Nasir isn't just a bad merchant, he's a dishonorable man. And let's not forget the delivery method. This wasn't a conversation. It wasn't a scroll slipped under a door. It was a clay tablet. The scribe pressed each wedge-shaped character into soft earth, then either left it to dry in the sun or baked it in a kiln. That tablet had to be delivered by hand, carried across streets or maybe even cities, placed with intent in front of Ea-Nasir, or someone responsible for passing it on. There was no send button. This was a message made of time, effort, and stone. And still, Nani chose to send it. That choice tells us everything. He wanted it recorded. He wanted it formal. He wanted his disappointment etched into the physical world, where it couldn't be ignored, deleted, or misunderstood. He wanted Ea-Nasir to hold it, to feel its weight, to understand in the language of hardened clay that his failure wasn't going unnoticed. That's the burn. Not in the anger, but in the restraint. Not in a curse, but in the clarity. Not in the volume, but in the permanence. There's something haunting about it. Because you realize, as you read, that Nani never expected an apology. Maybe he didn't even expect a response. What he wanted was to be remembered as the man who said something. The man who didn't let it slide. The man who stood up, not with a sword or a lawsuit, but with words and with clay. Today, we talk about clapbacks, dunks, and dragging someone online. We celebrate the cleverest tweets and the sharpest comments. But Nani was doing it first. His letter wasn't a rant. It was a blueprint. A masterclass in ancient disappointment. And the fact that we're still reading it all these years later is proof that he succeeded. He made his frustration immortal. So the next time you get a bad product or someone lets you down and you find yourself writing that carefully worded email that begins with "as previously discussed," remember Nani. Remember his tablet. Remember that in 1750 BCE, someone had a bad business interaction, and instead of staying silent, he made history. Because sometimes the most powerful message isn't the loudest. It's the one carved in clay, delivered with dignity, and signed not with fury, but with finality. Let's take a moment to really appreciate what we're dealing with here. The world's oldest known customer complaint, carved into a small, sun-baked clay tablet nearly 4,000 years ago. It reads like something you might find buried deep in a Google review section, after someone waited too long for their takeout or received the wrong shade of sofa. But this wasn't about food or furniture. This was about copper, and it was serious. The tablet in question, written by a man named Nani to the merchant Ea-Nasir, has been dubbed by modern readers as the first one-star review. But unlike today's slapdash online rants, Nani's words were chosen with precision. He couldn't just fire off a complaint while walking to lunch. He had to hire a scribe, dictate the message, review the wording, and approve the clay to be pressed and fired. This wasn't a comment, it was a statement. And the fact that we're still analyzing it today tells us just how effective it was. So what did Nani actually say? First, he sets the stage. Nani reminds Ea-Nasir that the copper he ordered had been prepaid. There was no ambiguity, no misunderstanding. Money had exchanged hands, a deal had been made. And yet, what Ea-Nasir delivered was, in Nani's eyes, beneath the standard they'd agreed on. The quality was poor. The service was insulting. And perhaps worst of all, Ea-Nasir didn't seem to care. But Nani wasn't just complaining about metal. He was complaining about the erosion of trust. He was documenting in permanent form that a social contract had been broken. The tone is respectful but firm, formal but laced with emotion. He mentions that his representative, the man he sent to collect the copper, was treated rudely, turned away without explanation. There's a sharp sting in the way Nani frames this, not just as a business failure, but as a personal slight. One of the most poignant parts of the tablet is where Nani tells Ea-Nasir he will no longer accept any copper that hasn't been personally inspected. In modern terms, this is the equivalent of saying, "I'm done trusting you. I'll need to see the product before I even think about payment." That's not just a critique, it's a redefinition of the relationship, a quiet severance. A refusal to engage on the same terms ever again. Imagine the tension of that moment. Ea-Nasir, standing in his home or shop, holding the clay tablet in his hands, reading the neatly carved cuneiform. There's no shouting, no threats. But the meaning is loud and clear. Your reputation is damaged. Your word no longer means what it used to. And now there's a tablet that says so. We don't know if Ea-Nasir ever responded. We don't know if he felt shame or if he rolled his eyes and tossed the tablet aside. What we do know is that this little clay message survived. Somehow, it was kept, preserved, buried in the dust of ancient Ur, only to be rediscovered thousands of years later by archaeologists who probably didn't expect to find a Bronze Age equivalent of customer feedback. When scholars first translated it, there was a sense of surprise, not just at the content, but at how modern it sounded. The phrasing may have been old, but the sentiment was timeless. The irritation, the disappointment, the insistence on fairness, these are human constants. The fact that it was all wrapped in the dry, official tone of ancient commerce only made it more striking. And that's why this tablet has captured so much attention. Because it's not just a quirky historical artifact, it's a mirror. A quiet reminder that long before smartphones and chatbots, long before five-star rating systems and refund policies, there were people trying to hold each other accountable. People who took the time to write down, in permanent language, "This is not acceptable." What Nani wrote wasn't poetry, but it had rhythm. It wasn't philosophy, but it carried truth. It was, in every way, a review, directed not at a product, but at the integrity of a man who failed to deliver what he promised. It wasn't angry. It was clear. It wasn't loud. It was lasting. Today, we leave reviews in seconds. We vent in lowercase fury, scribble sarcasm, and hit submit without a second thought. Nani had to think. He had to mean every word. And because of that, his complaint has outlived not just Ea-Nasir, but cities, empires, languages, and time itself. So what did he really say? He said, "I trusted you. You failed me. And now I'm making sure the world knows." He said, "You are not what you promised." And in doing so, Nani wrote the ancient world's most unforgettable one-star review, pressed into clay, fired by the sun, and read again thousands of years later by strangers who still understand exactly how he felt. To understand why Nani's complaint mattered, you have to understand the value of copper, not just as a metal, but as a symbol of civilization itself. In the world of ancient Sumer, copper wasn't optional, it was foundational. You couldn't build a city without it. You couldn't fight a war or grow a harvest or honor the gods without tools and ornaments forged from it. And getting copper wasn't simple. It wasn't mined locally in every city. It came through long, dangerous trade routes. Mountains, deserts, and unreliable rivers stood between supply and demand. So when you finally got your shipment, it had better be good. That's what made Ea-Nasir's mistake, or betrayal, depending on your interpretation, so serious. He wasn't just delivering bad metal. He was undermining a supply chain. He was putting lives, reputations, and entire business relationships at risk. In a fragile economy built on trust and travel, a single dishonest shipment could fracture more than one connection. It could ripple outward like a cracked tablet in the sun. Copper in the ancient world was a bit like oil today. It was traded widely, hoarded by the powerful, and constantly monitored for quality. Impure copper wasn't just annoying, it could be dangerous. A weakened tool could fail. A broken blade could cost a soldier his life. And to the merchants and craftspeople who relied on consistent quality, every shipment was a test of character as much as material. That's why Nani's fury comes through so clearly in the clay. He didn't just lose money, he lost confidence. The copper he received wasn't just below standard, it was an insult to the process, to the trust that bound the entire Mesopotamian trade system together. Ea-Nasir didn't just send the wrong product. He broke a silent promise that every merchant in Sumer lived by: do what you say you'll do. We often think of ancient people as operating with fewer expectations than us, as if they were somehow more tolerant of errors, delays, or inefficiencies. But Nani's letter proves otherwise. His expectations were high, and justifiably so. He had traveled, or at least sent agents through hostile territories. He had paid up front. He had waited. And instead of being rewarded for his faith in the system, he was handed a load of copper so poor it wasn't even worth accepting. And to top it off, his servant was treated with what he described as open disrespect. That last part, about how his messenger was treated, might seem small, but it says everything. This wasn't just a broken business deal. This was personal. It wasn't just the copper that was insulted. It was Nani himself, his status, his judgment, his place in the intricate web of trade and honor that allowed cities like Ur to function. That's the real cost of bad service in the ancient world. It wasn't just financial, it was reputational. When a merchant like Ea-Nasir delivered low-quality goods, he didn't just risk losing a customer, he risked becoming the subject of a clay tablet, the kind of public complaint that could be shared, repeated, archived. And once your name was inscribed as untrustworthy, that mark could last far longer than the goods you tried to sell. Because clay, as it turns out, doesn't forget. And even though Ea-Nasir likely handled many other transactions, this single moment of subpar performance has become his legacy. His name is now synonymous with bad service, with broken promises, with what happens when commerce fails its ethical core. All because one man decided not to stay quiet. The economics of this are profound. In a modern world, we have layers of protection. Contracts, reviews, refunds. But in Sumer, you had clay and words and a system that relied on everyone taking those things seriously. When those broke down, you didn't just lose one deal, you risked weakening the entire structure. And copper, being as central as it was, turned this from a minor hiccup into a major issue. You can almost feel Nani's frustration building as he dictates the tablet. Not just because he got a bad shipment, but because he shouldn't have to be doing this at all. The very act of writing the complaint, of putting it into the hands of a scribe, of sealing and delivering it, was time-consuming, costly, and humiliating. He wasn't trying to start a fight. He was trying to salvage trust. That's the paradox of customer service, both then and now. A complaint, when written well, isn't just about anger. It's about hope. The hope that things can be fixed, that someone will listen, that the system still works. Nani wasn't just venting, he was testing the boundaries of accountability in a world held together by trade and expectation. And so the price of copper wasn't measured only in minas or shekels, it was measured in faith, in how much a person believed the merchant they dealt with would honor their word. Once that faith was broken, it didn't matter how much metal you offered. The real currency had already been lost. Thousands of years later, we still operate on the same fragile lines. Every online order, every handshake deal, every delivery that arrives a day late or a dollar short, it all echoes the same structure. Materials come and go, but trust, that's what the world runs on. And when that trust is broken, someone might write it down, someone might remember, someone might even carve it into clay. Just ask Ea-Nasir. When you think of a complaint today, you might picture a grumbling email, a bad Yelp review, or a muttered comment at the customer service desk. It's cathartic, sometimes effective, but often ephemeral. A message shot into the ether of the internet, rarely resulting in anything more than a canned reply. But in ancient Sumer, a complaint wasn't just emotional expression. It carried legal and social weight. It was part of a system. It was evidence. And in many cases, it was the first step in formal accountability. The Mesopotamians were some of the earliest humans to build cities, establish writing, and form complex bureaucracies. They weren't just trading barley and copper. They were building a structure for how people should behave toward one another. At the center of that structure was record keeping, From temple receipts to personal loans to complaints about shipments gone wrong, everything was written down on clay, in cuneiform, slowly, carefully, permanently. A complaint was never just a rant, it was a document. Let's return to Nani's letter to Ionasir. On the surface, it reads like a private grievance, one man frustrated with another. But underneath the tone and the specific complaint lies something more significant. The assumption that this tablet could be shown, referenced, even submitted to an authority. Nani wasn't just blowing off steam, he was building a case. He was protecting his name, and if push came to shove, he had proof. That proof wasn't a minor thing. In a society without widespread literacy, written words had power beyond their content. To be able to present a clay tablet meant you had resources, connections, and most importantly, credibility. The tablet wasn't just about copper. It was about who was telling the truth, who had a record, who was prepared to show their work. In fact, many of the surviving complaint tablets from Mesopotamia show a similar structure: a statement of facts, a description of the problem, a mention of prior agreements or payments, and often a request for correction or restitution. This wasn't accidental. It was formulaic. And the formula suggests something very modern: precedent. A complaint had to be structured because it might end up in a legal setting. Not a courtroom with robes and gavels, but a temple, a council of elders, a group of merchants at the Karum. There's even evidence that certain complaints, especially those involving trade or property, could result in arbitration. In other words, there were people whose job it was to read both sides and make a ruling. We don't have the full records of how these disputes played out, but the existence of so many tablets with careful, consistent formatting suggests that people expected their complaints to be read seriously. They wrote not just to express themselves, but to influence outcomes. And let's not underestimate the risk involved in making a formal complaint. Calling someone out, especially a merchant or someone of standing, meant you were stepping into the spotlight. You were saying, "I believe in this system enough to challenge it publicly." That's no small decision. It required courage, especially if you weren't in a position of equal power. But the act of writing it down, of making your story real in clay, gave you strength. It gave you leverage. It also gave you memory. In a world without digital storage, a clay tablet was about as close to permanence as you could get. Once dried or baked, it didn't degrade easily. Unlike spoken words, it couldn't be denied or forgotten. If someone tried to rewrite history, your tablet stood in the way. And while most complaints probably lived quiet lives, read once or twice, resolved in some back room, some, like Nani's, endured. That endurance matters, because it reminds us that legal systems don't start with grand courts or sweeping declarations. They start with people writing things down. They start with frustration given form, with justice made tangible, one clay rectangle at a time. And in this, the Mesopotamians were ahead of their time. They understood that trust needed backup. They understood that fairness had to be enforced, not just hoped for. And they understood that the act of complaining, when done with care and intention, wasn't just noise. It was the foundation of fairness. Today, we take for granted the idea that complaints can become legal action, that we can email a company, file a dispute, or call an ombudsman. But these practices are built on something ancient. They're built on clay, on the hands of scribes, on the slow, careful act of saying, "I was wronged, and I can prove it." So the next time you think of writing a review or making a report or even just jotting down what went wrong, think of Nani. Think of his tablet. Think of all the people who came before him, who wrote not to vent, but to defend the truth, to mark injustice, to push the world, however slightly, towards something better. Not just a rant, a record, a beginning, a clay-bound call for fairness. In the world of ancient Sumer, the scribe was a powerful figure. Not powerful in the way kings were, or priests or warriors, but powerful in the way that someone with the ability to turn spoken frustration into permanent record could be. Because in a society where the average person couldn't write, and where every formal communication needed to be literally carved into wet clay, scribes became the gatekeepers of memory, and sometimes the amplifiers of petty drama. You didn't write your own complaint in 2000 BCE. You hired someone to do it. And that someone was trained not just in writing, but in navigating the formal, legal, and social nuances of language. They knew how to phrase things in a way that made your complaint sound legitimate, pointed, and, when needed, devastating. A good scribe could take your personal disappointment and give it structure, rhythm, and cultural weight. In a way, they were the customer service whisperers of their time. But here's where it gets interesting. Scribes were not neutral. They were human. And humans, as we know, are rarely free from bias or commentary. Some complaints preserved on clay tablets suggest a tone, a flavor of passive aggression, irony, or formality so sharp it borders on sarcasm. You can almost feel the scribe rolling their eyes or smirking slightly as they press the stylus into the clay. Were they merely transcribing? Or were they, subtly, quietly, helping shape the message? This gives rise to a funny image: ancient scribes as proto-Karens. Not because they were rude or demanding, but because they were meticulous. They were the ones who knew exactly how to phrase a complaint so that it couldn't be ignored. They understood structure, tone, protocol. They knew when to insert just the right amount of emphasis, when to quote agreements, when to use a phrase like, "You are not what you promised," and make it land like a hammer. And in a society that placed enormous value on written words, that kind of influence was everything. Hiring a scribe wasn't cheap either. You didn't casually go to one over a minor inconvenience. If you did, you were signaling that this matter deserved documentation, that the offense was serious enough to warrant a written record. This, again, gave the scribe a degree of judgment. They weren't just note-takers. They were editors, advisors, spin doctors with clay and reed. Imagine the dynamic. A merchant, flushed with irritation, shows up to a scribe's modest work area. He explains the situation: bad copper, rude service, missed deadlines. The scribe listens, maybe nods once or twice, and then begins crafting a message. Every sentence chosen carefully, every wedge mark pressed with intent. It had to be formal. It had to follow convention. But within that frame, there was room for tone, for subtlety, for style. It's this subtlety that survives the centuries. When we read these complaint tablets today, what strikes us isn't just the content, it's the delivery, the precision, the calm fury. And that, more than anything, feels like the work of a practiced hand. Someone who's written this sort of thing before. Someone who knows the difference between sounding angry and sounding official. Between ranting and documenting. That difference matters. Because in ancient Sumer, the moment something was written down, it stopped being just your version of the story. It became a record. And once that clay dried, it could be shown to others, passed around, read aloud, stored in temple archives. A well-crafted complaint wasn't just a personal tool, it was a social weapon. And scribes were the blacksmiths. Were they always fair? Probably not. Were they sometimes embellishing, exaggerating, or dramatizing for effect? Who knows? But what's clear is that their role was central. They gave voice to those who couldn't write. And in doing so, they helped shape the history we now study. Many of the surviving complaint tablets are anonymous in their scribal authorship, but their fingerprints, figuratively, and sometimes literally, are all over the tone. It's tempting to imagine some scribes developing reputations. Go see Lugal over by the ziggurat, someone might whisper. He's good. He'll make sure your complaint gets noticed. Maybe some scribes were known for being bold, others for being subtle, still others for mastering the art of sounding polite while absolutely destroying someone's credibility. If so, they weren't just functionaries, they were artists. And let's not forget that scribes wrote everything, not just complaints. They wrote hymns, legal codes, trade records, myths, and love letters. But among these, the complaint stands out as a uniquely human genre. Because to write a complaint is to demand fairness. It's to hold someone accountable. And the scribe, sitting with his stylus and slab of wet clay, was the one who made that demand real. So yes, in a way, the scribes of ancient Sumer were the Karens of their day. Not because they were annoying, but because they knew how to make their voices, and the voices of others, impossible to ignore. They didn't shout, they didn't storm off. They just wrote it down, neatly, formally, permanently. And now, thousands of years later, we're still reading their work, still hearing their tone, still marveling at the quiet power of someone who knew how to press the truth into clay and make it last forever. When you think about ancient complaints, you might imagine something crude or dramatic, yelling in a marketplace, shouting at a merchant, maybe some flailing arms and bad words carved into stone. But the truth, at least in the case of the most famous Sumerian complaint, is far more chilling. It was polite, measured, almost unnervingly calm, and that's what made it brutal. The line, "You sent me bad copper," doesn't sound earth-shattering today, but in the world of ancient Mesopotamia, that was a serious accusation. Copper was currency. Copper was power. Copper was civilization. It was used to make tools, weapons, religious offerings, and instruments of trade. Getting the wrong kind of copper wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a betrayal, a slap in the face, a crack in the trust that held business and society together. But Nani, the customer who received that bad copper from the merchant Nasir, didn't respond with rage. He didn't hurl insults or threats. He hired a scribe. He sat down. He took a breath. And he delivered one of the most cold-blooded, devastatingly restrained complaint letters the ancient world ever produced. The tone is what makes it so effective. There's no fire in it, no emotional outbursts, no desperation, just facts, carefully laid out, one by one. You can almost feel the temperature dropping as the letter progresses. "I paid you in advance. I sent my servant to retrieve what was promised. What you gave me was not acceptable." Every sentence is a clean incision, carving away Nasir's credibility. That's the genius of polite brutality. Nani didn't need to scream to be heard. He didn't need exclamation points or dramatic flourishes. He had clay, and time, and intention. He made sure that each word was etched with enough clarity and structure to speak volumes, without ever raising its voice. And maybe that's what makes this letter so modern, because we know this tone. We've used this tone. It's the corporate email that opens with, "As per our previous discussion." It's the review that says, "I had high hopes, but was disappointed." It's the letter that calmly lists every detail you failed to deliver, while keeping a perfectly neutral face. It's not anger, it's precision, and it's terrifying. What's fascinating is how much effort went into crafting this tone. Writing in cuneiform wasn't easy. It took training, time, and physical labor. Each wedge had to be pressed into wet clay with a stylus. Every line, every phrase had to be planned. You didn't revise easily. You didn't delete. You had to get it right the first time. So when Nani accused Nasir of sending substandard copper and then added that he would refuse any future shipments not personally approved, he wasn't just setting a boundary. He was delivering a blow that would last. Literally. That tablet didn't get tossed in a trash bin. It was hardened, preserved, and eventually uncovered thousands of years later. This wasn't just a customer service complaint. It was a statement of record, a performance in restraint, a masterclass in how to express deep disappointment with a smile that never quite reaches the eyes. And it worked, because we're still talking about it. Because historians and archaeologists, upon translating it, didn't just log it away as a transaction. They recognized its tone. They felt its rhythm. They noted how the sharpest lines came dressed in the calmest words. It resonated not just as history, but as something deeply, universally human. What made it brutal wasn't just the content, it was the control. Nani was showing that he could remain composed, that he didn't need to stoop, that the facts alone were enough. And in doing so, he put all the weight of his credibility, his disappointment, and his expectation into a single, deliberate document. "You sent me bad copper." It's such a simple phrase, but when placed in context, financial, cultural, emotional, it becomes loaded. It says, "You knew better." It says, "You broke our agreement." It says, "I see you." And perhaps most importantly, it says, "This won't go unnoticed." There's something powerful about that kind of confrontation. Not the kind that shouts, but the kind that documents, that takes the time to write it all down, that doesn't need theatrics, because it knows the truth is sharp enough. In a world before email chains, court systems, or customer complaint hotlines, this was how you held someone accountable. You wrote it down. You handed it over. You made sure that your version of the story existed in clay. And if it was written well enough, if it was polite enough, structured enough, sharp enough, it didn't need embellishment. It just needed to last. And in this case, it did. Long enough for us to read it, long enough for us to feel it, long enough for us to remember that sometimes the quietest voices carry the most lasting weight. Because when Nani wrote, "You sent me bad copper," what he really meant was, You promised something. You failed. And now the world will know. Long before the internet, before hashtags and angry comment sections, before someone could be canceled for bad service or broken promises, the people of ancient Sumer had another way of holding others accountable. Clay. Clay that was written on, dried, and sometimes publicly displayed. In the absence of a digital timeline, clay tablets became the timeline. And complaints, especially well-crafted ones, had a way of going viral. It's easy to imagine the world of Sumer as a quiet place. Mud brick homes, winding canals, farmers and priests and merchants going about their day in silence. But in reality, these cities were busy, bustling, and full of chatter. Information traveled quickly, and reputation was everything. If someone cheated you, if a merchant delivered bad copper, or if a deal went south, you didn't just fume in private, you told people. And if you really wanted it to stick, you wrote it down. And once something was written down in Sumer, it didn't disappear. There was no delete button, no archive folder. A clay tablet was physical, permanent, and if placed in the right location, very, very visible. Historians believe that some complaints, especially those involving trade, weren't just meant for the recipient. They were intended for others to see, a kind of ancient broadcast. Tablets could be displayed in public spaces, stored in temple archives where many could read them, or circulated through merchant networks. These weren't just personal grievances. They were warnings, reviews, cautionary tales in cuneiform. In that sense, public complaints in Sumer functioned like social media posts today. They were part of a reputation economy where one bad experience could ripple outward and influence future decisions. A merchant who found himself the subject of multiple complaints might discover that business suddenly got quiet. A customer who regularly filed grievances might become feared or avoided. The public nature of the record added pressure to behave well. It raised the stakes. This wasn't just gossip, it was accountability. Let's go back to our friend Ea Nasir, the copper merchant who received Nani's famous complaint. There's no evidence that Nani's tablet was displayed on a wall like a poster. But the structure and tone of the message suggests something more than just a private letter. Nani wanted his complaint to be read. He wanted it to endure. He chose language that was formal, clear, and composed. Not just to be taken seriously by Ea Nasir, but possibly by others who might encounter it. And even if the tablet wasn't openly displayed, the story it told may have spread. In a community where people traded goods, shared messengers, and visited the same temples, news traveled. A well-worded complaint didn't need a massive audience to make an impact. It just needed the right eyes and enough time. There's something powerful about that. In a world where people couldn't write for themselves, the act of hiring a scribe and commissioning a complaint was already a signal. You were investing resources to make your grievance known. You were saying, "This matters, and I want others to know about it." The clay tablet became a social artifact, a physical expression of trust broken and fairness demanded. Today, we scroll past thousands of opinions, stars, ratings, angry blurbs. We've become numb to outrage. But imagine a world where every complaint required thought, cost money, and had to be literally pressed into the earth. That changes the tone. It gives weight to the words. And when those tablets ended up in the public eye, they shaped stories. They shaped reputations, and sometimes they shaped justice. In a way, temples functioned like the Facebook walls of Sumer, not just religious centers, but repositories of documents, agreements, and complaints. If a dispute needed resolution, the temple might store the relevant tablet or present it in a way that others could access. This wasn't just bureaucracy, it was community theater. Everyone knew the stakes, everyone played a role, and the consequences were real. A merchant whose name appeared too often on these clay feeds could lose trust. In a world built on word of mouth and shared networks, you couldn't afford that. Reputation was currency, and a public complaint could devalue it instantly. There were no marketing campaigns to clean up your image, no crisis management team, just your name on a hardened slab of truth, or at least someone else's version of it. It's oddly comforting, isn't it? To realize that long before smartphones and trending hashtags, humans were still doing the same thing, sharing stories, airing frustrations, warning others. We've always cared about who's reliable, we've always wanted fairness, and we've always looked for ways to let the world know when someone broke that trust. So yes, in a strange and clay-covered way, ancient Sumer had its own form of social media. Not instant, not global, but powerful, permanent, and sometimes poetic. Because in the end, whether it's a viral tweet or a wedge-shaped mark pressed into wet clay, the goal is the same: to be heard. To say, this happened, and to make sure it's not forgotten. When we think about ancient temples, we tend to picture towering ziggurats or incense-filled sanctuaries, places of worship, devotion, and ritual. In Sumer, temples certainly were sacred spaces, devoted to gods and celestial order. But they also played a far more grounded role in society. They were centers of economic life, bureaucratic power, and most surprisingly, dispute resolution. If something went wrong in your business dealings, if someone cheated you, broke a promise, or delivered subpar goods, you didn't necessarily go to court. You went to the temple. In the absence of a centralized legal system like we have today, the temple stood as both a spiritual authority and a civic institution. It was where people stored contracts, logged transactions, and sometimes filed complaints. Not because the priests were lawyers, but because the temple represented cosmic justice. To lie in a temple's presence, or worse, to be judged poorly by its officials, wasn't just socially damning. It was seen as morally and spiritually dangerous. So what did this actually look like in practice? Let's say a merchant, perhaps someone like our infamous friend Ian Nasir, sells copper to a buyer, and the copper turns out to be poor quality. The buyer is furious. Maybe a tablet is written and sent as a formal complaint. But if the issue escalates, if restitution is demanded, or if trust is broken badly enough, the temple may be the next stop. Not just for prayer, but for resolution. Temples kept records, they housed scribes, they had neutral space. That made them ideal for settling conflicts. Some scholars believe that temples acted almost like arbitration courts. Both parties could present their version of events, possibly with tablets or witnesses, and the temple staff, or those in charge of temple administration, would offer judgment. This wasn't simply about law, it was about restoring balance. In Mesopotamian belief, the gods maintained order through a concept called me, a kind of divine blueprint for how the universe should work. Justice, fairness, honesty, all of these were aspects of me. When someone broke a promise or committed a wrong, they weren't just violating a social norm, they were disrupting divine balance. By going to the temple, people weren't just solving a problem, they were trying to restore me, to realign human action with the cosmic order. And the process could be public. This wasn't a backroom negotiation. Complaints might be read aloud, witnesses might be called. Tablets were presented, sometimes sealed in clay envelopes, opened only in the temple's presence. It was slow, formal, deliberate, and deeply symbolic. Of course, this system wasn't perfect. Not every temple decision was fair. Power and wealth still influenced outcomes. But even so, the temple offered something that no other institution in early cities could: legitimacy. A resolution made at the temple carried weight. It became part of the social record. And in a society that valued written agreements and reputation, that was often enough. Interestingly, many of the tablets we now read as ancient complaints were found in temple archives. That tells us something about their purpose. These weren't meant to be thrown away or kept in private. They were stored, preserved. Maybe because the dispute had been settled, maybe because it hadn't. But in either case, the temple became the place where memory was kept, and where justice, however imperfect, was attempted. This raises an important point. In Sumer, justice wasn't about punishment. It was about restoration. The goal wasn't necessarily to shame or destroy, but to repair, to make things right, or at least less wrong. And in that sense, the temple acted not only as a judge, but as a kind of healer. It helped society stitch itself back together after moments of broken trust. There's something deeply human in that. Because even today, we don't just want legal resolution. We want acknowledgement. We want a place to go where someone says, yes, this happened. Yes, it mattered. The Sumerians found that place in their temples. It was where they brought their anger, their disappointment, their damaged goods, and tried as best they could to find balance again. And perhaps that's why so many of these clay tablets feel so poignant. They weren't just cold documentation. They were pieces of personal drama, infused with belief and ritual. A complaint wasn't just an accusation. It was a cry for justice in the shadow of the gods. So next time you picture an ancient temple, don't just imagine prayers or offerings. Picture two people standing before a high-ranking official, tablets in hand. Picture the quiet tension as a sealed envelope is cracked open. Picture the words being read aloud, clear, calm, devastating. And picture, above them all, the gods listening. Because in ancient Sumer, justice didn't wear a robe. It wore a robe and burned incense. And it sat in a temple, balancing the scales of copper and conscience, one clay tablet at a time. When we picture the ancient world, we often imagine grand rituals, solemn processions, kings on thrones, and gods in the sky. What we don't always picture is the everyday noise, the merchants grumbling about missed payments, farmers irritated by boundary disputes, or customers frustrated with shoddy goods. But the truth is, complaint culture wasn't born in the modern age. It has been around for thousands of years, and in ancient Sumer, it was surprisingly common. Complaining in Sumerian society wasn't a failure of character. It was a feature of civilization. The mere fact that you had the ability and the expectation to file a formal grievance meant you were part of something bigger than yourself, a social contract. You could point to an injustice, describe it in detail, and have it recorded in clay. Not only was this acceptable, it was structured. There was a tone, a rhythm, a vocabulary that had developed around the act of filing a complaint. And it happened often. Archaeologists have uncovered dozens, perhaps hundreds of clay tablets that contain complaints from all walks of life. These weren't just one-off grievances from angry elites. They came from merchants, landowners, officials, and average citizens. The issues ranged from trade disputes to loan defaults, property encroachments to mistreatment of servants. The breadth of subjects shows us something striking. People in ancient Sumer complained about many of the same things we do today. One tablet might detail a disagreement over the delivery of grain. Another might record a dispute between neighbors over the boundary of a shared plot of land. Some tablets describe servants being beaten, contracts being ignored, debts being unpaid. It wasn't all about copper. It was about fairness, about how society should function, about making sure that one person's mistake didn't become someone else's misfortune. And these weren't anonymous ventings. These tablets had names, dates, locations. They were addressed to real people and often referenced previous interactions. They existed within a living system of accountability. The scribe who wrote them wasn't just recording emotion, he was creating evidence. And the people reading them, temple staff, community elders, other merchants, understood what was at stake. It's easy to assume that complaint culture is a product of modern life, amplified by digital communication and global capitalism. But in reality, the impulse to speak up, to object, to document when something goes wrong, that's ancient. It's as old as contracts, as old as trade, as old as community. People don't complain because they're fragile. They complain because they care. About standards, about trust, about being treated with decency. In fact, the volume of surviving complaints suggests that people in Sumer saw the act of complaining not as disruptive, but as necessary. It was how you kept systems honest, how you defended your rights, how you warned others, and how you reminded the community that actions had consequences. This wasn't a culture of negativity, it was a culture of expectations. And that's important because complaint culture often gets a bad rap. We use the term to describe people who nitpick, who can't be pleased, who just want to make noise. But in Sumer, the act of complaining was more noble than that. It was civic, it was constructive. A complaint wasn't just about you, it was about protecting shared norms, making sure no one could abuse power without someone else saying, "Not this time." And it wasn't just about winning. Many complaints didn't result in dramatic reversals or public punishments. Sometimes, the outcome was simply a conversation, a negotiation, or a note of warning. But even that mattered. Even that was enough to shift behavior. A well-written complaint could travel further than a shout. It could make someone think twice next time. We often underestimate how powerful written words can be, especially in societies where not everyone could write. In Sumer, if your complaint was written in clay, it meant you had taken the time, spent the resources, and followed the rules. You had transformed your frustration into something formal, official, and enduring. And once that tablet dried, it could be stored, referenced, and remembered. That's what makes complaint culture in Sumer so fascinating. It wasn't about complaining for the sake of it. It was about record keeping, about weaving your voice into the larger fabric of civic life, about being part of a tradition that said, we will not let wrongdoing slip by unnoticed. There's something almost beautiful about that, because it reminds us that to complain is not to be small or petty. It is, in its best form, an act of care, a defense of value, a push for better. So the next time someone says, we live in an era of too much complaining, remember Sumer, remember the tablets, remember Nanny, who refused to stay silent about bad copper. And remember all the unnamed voices who, thousands of years ago, picked up a stylus or hired someone to do it and said, this isn't right. They didn't just grumble and move on. They documented. And in doing so, they created a culture where complaints weren't noise. They were history. Not all complaints in ancient Sumer were grand matters of failing trade deals or ruined copper shipments. In fact, many of the complaints etched into clay by scribes were delightfully small, painfully familiar, and hilariously human. Some of them were about property lines, others were about loans not paid back, and some were, as one can only imagine, with a sigh, about a goat. That's right, a goat, possibly stolen, probably argued over, definitely immortalized in cuneiform. These civil complaints weren't high drama. They were the slow-burning issues of everyday life, the kind of problems that, while not empire-shaking, could absolutely ruin your day. And the very fact that people took the time, effort, and money to turn these complaints into clay tells us just how seriously they took their small conflicts. Let's imagine this situation for a moment. You live in a dusty, crowded corner of a Sumerian city. Your neighbor, with whom you've always had an unspoken tension, suddenly acquires a goat that looks suspiciously familiar. The markings match, the behavior is the same, and your goat, mysteriously, is nowhere to be found. There's no security footage, no digital receipts, just a gnawing certainty, and your word against his. So what do? If you're like many people in ancient Sumer, you go to a scribe. You explain the situation, you describe the goat, you state your ownership, and you ask for the complaint to be put into writing, not just to tell your side, but to make it official. Because once something is in clay, it has weight, permanence, authority. And it didn't stop with goats. We have tablets about missing donkeys, about damaged property, about improperly irrigated fields. One tablet describes a man who lent grain to a friend and never got it back. Another accuses a neighbor of building a wall slightly, just slightly, over the agreed boundary. These weren't grand betrayals. They were minor social fractures. But they mattered, because small cracks left untended can eventually pull a whole community apart. In modern terms, these tablets are the ancient equivalent of calling the HOA or leaving a strongly worded note on someone's car windshield. They're not about destruction. They're about establishing norms, setting limits, making it clear that even in the most mundane of matters, there is a right way to behave and a wrong one. And here's what's especially striking. These tablets were written with the same care and structure as major trade disputes. The language was formal. The tone was measured. Even the silliest complaint received the same respectful treatment. That's because the act of writing was sacred, serious. To press your complaint into clay meant you believed in something: justice, fairness, clarity. Sometimes these tablets even reference previous arguments, as if the scribe had a mental file of ongoing issues between two residents. You can imagine the sighs, the eye rolls, the scribe nodding along, stylus ready, muttering, "Back again? Let's document it." But beneath the humor is something important. These complaints show us that ancient people didn't just endure bad behavior, they pushed back, even when the stakes were low. They believed that order had to be maintained from the ground up, that every person had a responsibility, not just to gods and kings, but to their neighbors. That belief gave rise to what we might call the first civic disputes. Disputes that didn't need armies or divine intervention, just someone to listen, to record, to mediate. And this act of turning a petty grievance into formal record wasn't just about resolution, it was about memory. Once a tablet was dried or baked, it lived on. Stored in a temple, passed to elders, used as precedent for future cases. It became part of a quiet archive of community life, a running ledger of who did what, when, and why it mattered. So when we read about someone complaining that their goat was stolen, it's not just funny, it's profound. It's a reminder that community is built not only on shared goals and celebrations, but on the ability to handle the small things, to speak up when boundaries are crossed, to insist, however gently, that some lines should not be blurred, even if they're drawn in the dirt. And in a strange, beautiful way, these ancient civil complaints connect us to those who lived before us. They show us that no matter how advanced or primitive a society may be, people always care about fairness, about space, about animals and neighbors and shared resources, and they care enough to write it down. So yes, someone in Sumer, thousands of years ago, believed strongly enough that his neighbor had stolen his goat to hire a scribe, pay for clay, and have his voice preserved through time. And now, thousands of years later, we're still reading that voice, still smiling at its clarity, still nodding at its sincerity, still recognizing, deep down, that maybe we would have done the same. We tend to think of buyer reviews as a recent invention, a product of e-commerce, smartphones, and the irresistible human urge to rate everything from restaurants to hairbrushes. But the instinct behind buyer reviews is ancient. In fact, the people of Sumer were writing scathing assessments of bad business long before the first digital star rating ever existed. And in a world without Yelp or Amazon, where reputations were everything, and clay tablets were the medium of memory, a single well-written complaint could be more damaging than a dozen bad reviews today. At the center of this proto-review culture were the merchants, some trustworthy, others less so. In the case of Nasir, the now infamous Sumerian copper merchant, we see the earliest known example of what we might call going viral for the wrong reasons. Nasir's name appears in multiple tablets, not as a hero of trade, but as a warning. The copper was poor, the customer service worse, and his unhappy clients weren't whispering behind his back. They were writing it down. When we look at these clay tablets, we begin to see a pattern. Complaints were not just private expressions of frustration. They were public records, documents that could be shown, passed around, or stored in temples and archives. Once your name was associated with poor conduct, it didn't just stay between you and the buyer. It became part of the larger narrative. In a sense, the Sumerians were developing an early feedback loop. And like today's online review culture, it operated on two principles: memory and visibility. If a merchant repeatedly delivered bad goods or treated clients poorly, the clay would reflect that. Their name would travel further than their product. And in a society where long-distance trade depended on trust, that was a devastating consequence. Imagine being a merchant in Sumer, trying to expand your network. You reach a new city, you offer your goods, and someone quietly pulls out a tablet bearing your name and a complaint. Suddenly, doors close, deals vanish. That one moment, one mistake, one lie, one insult has followed you across the desert, etched in clay. The idea of a bad review is universal in this way. It's not about revenge, it's about warning others. It's about sending a message. This person did not deliver what they promised. Buyer beware. But unlike modern review systems, there was no platform to dispute or delete the claim. You couldn't flag a tablet as unfair. You couldn't pay to have it removed or buried in SEO results. Once it existed, which means merchants had every incentive to behave well, not out of pure ethics perhaps, but out of professional survival. And complaints didn't only target product quality. They often included behavior, tone, attitude, disrespect toward messengers, delays in delivery, failure to communicate clearly. These weren't just material failures, they were relational ones. And in many cases, the latter were seen as even more serious. After all, a damaged shipment could be explained. A damaged relationship? Much harder to fix. So the complaints served a broader function. They didn't just document what went wrong. They documented how someone made another person feel, and how that feeling, when translated into structured language, could become a kind of social currency. It's tempting to romanticize ancient trade as a system built purely on handshakes and honor. But the tablets show us that this world was as complicated and flawed as ours. People cut corners, they overpromised, they made excuses, and when they did, they were called out, not in anger, but in writing. This quiet accountability helped shape the marketplace. It created a culture where merchants were evaluated not just on their product, but on their consistency, their conduct, their word. And while not every complaint led to consequences, the accumulation of them absolutely could. Enough clay stacked against you, and your name might become a punchline. Or worse, forgotten entirely. In a way, buyer reviews are a form of democracy. They give power to the individual, a voice in a system that might otherwise ignore them. And the Sumerians understood this. Their complaints, when read aloud in temple courts or merchant gatherings, gave visibility to the voiceless. They reminded the community that trade was built not on goods, but on trust. And maybe that's what makes these ancient reviews so enduring. They weren't just practical, they were principled. When Nani wrote to Ea-Nasir, he wasn't just asking for better copper. He was demanding better treatment, better standards, a better system. That demand still echoes today. So the next time you leave a review or read one, consider the lineage. Consider the merchants behaving badly in 1750 BCE and the people who said with stylus and clay, "We deserve better." No algorithms, no comment section, just the permanent weight of words drying in the sun, waiting to be read. We often think of the ancient world as serious and ceremonial, filled with formal rituals and rigid etiquette. But if you look closely, especially at the complaint tablets from Sumer, you'll find something else hidden beneath the formality. Shade. Real, cutting, calculated shade. Because even in a society where language was sacred and every letter was painstakingly pressed into clay, people still found a way to let their insults slip through the cracks. Let's be clear. Ancient Sumerians didn't insult the way we do today. They didn't call someone names in all caps or post memes to shame their enemies. But they had their own toolkit: passive aggression, formal disappointment, and clever phrasing that sliced deeper than any direct insult ever could. When someone wanted to destroy your reputation, they didn't yell. They wrote. Slowly. Permanently. One of the most famous examples comes, unsurprisingly, from Nani's complaint to Ea-Nasir. While the letter never uses foul language, the entire tone is that of someone so disgusted, so unimpressed, so utterly done with your nonsense that his very calmness becomes the insult. "You are not what you promised," he writes. "It's not profanity. It's poetry." And it hurts more. This kind of phrasing appears often in Sumerian tablets, especially in complaints. You'll see phrases like, "Your copper was not fit for use," or "You did not speak honestly," or "I sent my servant and he was treated with contempt." None of these are firestorms of rage, but they are precise, clear, and condemning. They don't just criticize the product, they criticize the character of the person behind it. That's where the real insult lives, in the implication. In a society where honor and reputation were everything, to say someone was dishonest, lazy, or unreliable wasn't just an opinion. It was a threat to their livelihood. Once it was written down, it could be read by others, shared, cited, used as precedent in future business. You weren't just being shamed, you were being defined. Some of these complaints go even further. They point out patterns of bad behavior. "You have done this before," or they cite witnesses. "My servant, who is trustworthy, can confirm." These additions were surgical. Not only was the person being accused, they were being cross-examined. Their excuses were being dismantled in front of clay, scribes, and gods. And yet, despite all of this, the language remained controlled. That was the real power. Because in Sumer, emotion had to be filtered through structure. You didn't shout in writing, you sharpened your words until they cut clean. This makes the insults in Sumerian complaints more sophisticated, and in many ways, more devastating than modern equivalents. There was no room for empty rage. You couldn't afford to sound childish or irrational. Every line had to serve your argument. Every word had to build your credibility. So when you insulted someone, you did it by undermining their integrity. One of the most biting phrases found in a tablet translates roughly to, "You have lost the respect of those who once trusted you." It sounds like something from a Shakespearean monologue, but it came from a dusty city thousands of years ago, written by someone who had simply had enough. And instead of throwing fists or raising their voice, they wrote it down, calmly, clearly, permanently. These kinds of complaints give us more than just historical insight. They give us emotional resonance, because we still use the same strategies today. When we write an email that starts with, as I've mentioned before, or leave a review that reads, "I expected more from someone with your experience," we're using the same social tools. We're not shouting. We're setting the stage for public accountability. And sometimes that's the most powerful form of protest. Not the loudest, not the angriest, but the most deliberate, the kind that says, "I see you, and so does everyone else now." It's fascinating that even in a world of reed pens and clay slabs, people were already mastering the art of language as leverage. They understood that the right insult, delivered with restraint and supported by fact, could outlast any scream, could be reread, could shape how others saw you. That's what makes Sumerian complaint tablets so remarkable. They aren't just about trade or logistics. They're about tone, about social intelligence, about how people turn disappointment into documentation, and documentation into a weapon. So yes, the insults are there, hidden behind the formality, coiled inside the calm. They come in the form of phrases that seem harmless, but carry centuries of cultural weight. "You failed to honor our agreement. You did not act as you should have. I will not deal with you again." You read them, and you wince, because you know exactly what they mean. No yelling, no swearing, just a voice from 1750 BCE saying with absolute clarity, "You've burned this bridge." And that, more than any modern insult, still lands, still lingers, still hurts. When we think of history, we often imagine great battles, royal decrees, or mythic origin stories carved in stone. But sometimes it's the smallest documents, the ones about missing copper, rude servants, or faulty deliveries that tell us the most. And nowhere is that more true than in the world of Sumerian complaint tablets. These aren't just records of frustration. They're tiny, durable windows into how people lived, worked, argued, and held each other accountable over 4,000 years ago. At first glance, a complaint tablet seems like an anomaly. Why would someone spend time and money to formally write down their annoyance? But then you realize, this is the point. The act of writing a complaint wasn't spontaneous. It required intent. It meant something. And that makes these tablets an unusually honest form of historical evidence. Most ancient texts come with an agenda. Religious hymns that praise the gods, royal inscriptions that celebrate victory, economic records designed to track assets. But a complaint? That's personal. That's emotional. That's someone saying, "This went wrong, and I want the world to know." It's not filtered through the voice of a priest or king. It's the voice of a person, a real one, likely annoyed, possibly furious, and definitely trying to get something resolved. This is what makes these tablets invaluable. They offer us a glimpse not into idealized life, but actual life. The messy, ordinary, frustrating parts of being human. The broken deals, the delayed shipments, the neighbor who didn't return a borrowed goat. Each tablet is like a fossil of social interaction, preserved in clay, untouched by time, waiting to be read. Take, for example, the famous complaint of Nani to Anasir. It's now one of the most well-known artifacts in the world, not because it's grand, but because it's relatable. Nani didn't write a poem. He didn't declare war. He just wanted his copper, and he wanted it to be good. The details he includes, the route his servant traveled, the payment he already made, the insult his agent received, these aren't just plot points in a complaint. They're real-life clues. They help us map trade routes, understand labor structures, and decode the social etiquette of the time. And Nani wasn't alone. Dozens of similar tablets have been found, each one a snapshot of tension, expectation, and consequence. Some deal with contracts broken. Others describe stolen goods, mistreated workers, or public insults. In every case, we learn not just what happened, but how people expected things to happen, what they assumed would be fair, what they considered unacceptable. In other words, complaints are a mirror. They show us the norms, not by stating them, but by revealing what happens when they're broken. And that's where the power of these tablets really lives. They don't just describe rules. They show what mattered enough to fight over, what people were willing to document, argue, and preserve, which relationships were worth salvaging, and which ones were being publicly cut off. The language itself is revealing too. Formal, restrained, but unmistakably firm. You can feel the layers: respect, disappointment, assertion. This wasn't the wild fury of an online review. It was the careful calculation of someone who knew that words mattered. And that makes the text feel modern, even in its oldest form. Historians now use these tablets not only to study trade and law, but to understand daily life, how people thought about justice, what they expected from business relationships, and how far they would go to make their voices heard. It turns out that in a society without paper, protest didn't vanish. It just hardened into clay. Even the act of delivering a complaint tells us something. You didn't just write it. You had to bring it, often through a servant, sometimes to a temple, occasionally to a council of elders. That physical journey was part of the process. You weren't just airing a grievance, you were presenting a case. And once a tablet was accepted into a temple archive, it became part of the collective memory, a permanent record, which is why we can read them today. Thousands of years later, still clear, still sharp, still pulsing with quiet human tension. These weren't meant to survive that long, and yet they did. So when we read these tablets today, we're not just peering into the past. We're hearing a voice, often frustrated, sometimes eloquent, always real. A voice that didn't want to be forgotten. A voice that used the tools available to demand fairness. In a way, complaint tablets are the earliest form of civil documentation. Not grand, but grounded. Not exalted, but human. And by preserving the moments where things went wrong, they show us the structures people built to try and make things right. It's history, yes, but not the kind written by victors. The kind written by the irritated, the disappointed, the determined. And maybe that's why it still resonates. Because sometimes the best way to understand a society isn't through its victories, but through its complaints. When we think about legal systems today, we picture judges in robes, gavel slams, courtrooms filled with lawyers and spectators. But in ancient Sumer, the legal system looked and sounded very different. There were no formal courts as we know them, no written constitutions or professional attorneys. And yet, somehow, complaints were heard, disputes were resolved, justice in its earliest form was pursued. To understand how complaints were handled in ancient Mesopotamia, we have to strip the concept of law back to its bones. In Sumer, law wasn't something locked away in books or recited by legal scholars. It was lived, it was remembered, and most importantly, it was written in clay. When someone like Nani had a complaint, say about being sold bad cod copper by a merchant like Ea-Nasir, it wasn't just an expression of frustration. It was a legal act. Once that complaint was pressed into a clay tablet by a scribe, it became evidence, not in the sense of a police investigation, but as part of a broader, deeply social system of resolution. Sumerian society revolved around reputation. Deals were built on trust, and that trust was maintained through documentation. Complaints, especially well-documented ones, were powerful tools, not just for revenge, but for negotiation. A clay tablet wasn't just a letter, it was a marker of formal objection, and it triggered a process. So, what happened next? That depends. In many cases, disputes were brought before local elders, respected figures in the community who knew the norms, understood the stakes, and were trusted to mediate fairly. Sometimes, issues were taken to temple officials who acted as spiritual and social authorities. These weren't courtrooms in the modern sense. They were gatherings, conversations with rules guided by memory, honor, and precedent. In larger cities, there were formalized roles. The city of Ur, for instance, had judges appointed to settle disputes, especially those related to trade or property. These judges may have consulted tablets, called witnesses, and even issued rulings that were themselves recorded in writing. In some cases, multiple tablets tell the story of a dispute unfolding over time, an initial complaint, a response, a decision, and sometimes even an appeal. That's right, appeals existed. If someone felt a decision was unjust, they could, in theory, bring their case to a higher authority. Usually this meant the temple or the governor's office, depending on the city-state's structure. And again, clay was the medium. Each step of the process was documented. Carefully. Permanently. It's important to remember that writing was expensive. You didn't make a complaint lightly. And because of that, each case that was brought forward usually had real weight behind it. The person complaining had made a calculated decision that it was worth the time, the resources, and the public exposure to pursue justice. That decision gave complaints legitimacy. And it made the legal system something people engaged with deliberately, not frivolously. This is also why the language of these complaints matters so much. They weren't emotional tirades, they were structured arguments. A good complaint laid out what was agreed upon, what went wrong, what had been done so far to resolve it, and what the complainant wanted moving forward. Think of them as legal briefs, not long-winded essays, but tight, pointed, and clear. And once a complaint was received, the other party, like Ea-Nasir, might be called to respond. In some cases, this was verbal. In others, a response was also written in clay. These back-and-forth tablets are rare, but when they appear, they give us a glimpse into a real, functional system of negotiation and mediation. It wasn't perfect, it was slow. It depended heavily on the literacy and bias of those in power. But it worked. Perhaps most impressively, the Sumerians understood the importance of enforcement. Rulings weren't just suggestions. In certain cases, judgments could be tied to religious oaths, statements made before the gods, which carried enormous spiritual consequences. Breaking such an oath could bring down not just social shame, but divine punishment. Temples played a major role here. They weren't just houses of worship, they were legal archives, trusted mediators, and occasionally enforcers. If someone broke an agreement and the matter had been judged in the temple's presence, their standing in the community could be destroyed. Your reputation wasn't just social, it was spiritual. And once it cracked, it could be nearly impossible to repair. All of this gives us a picture of a legal system that wasn't fast, but was firm. It wasn't codified like modern law, but it was deeply embedded in daily life. And at the heart of that system was the clay tablet, not just as a medium, but as a contract, a weapon, a shield. Today, we file complaints online. We rely on customer service bots, digital forms, and legal representatives. But in ancient Sumer, you relied on your voice and the stylus of a scribe. You brought your truth to the temple, to the elders, to the gods, and you trusted that your words, once etched in clay, would carry weight. And they did. Because 4,000 years later, we're still reading them, still listening, still learning how, even in the earliest days of civilization, humans found a way to say, "This isn't fair, and something must be done." It's easy to dismiss ancient complaints as historical curiosities, odd little moments of bureaucratic frustration etched into clay thousands of years ago. But if you take a step back and really look at them, these grievances from ancient Sumer become something far more powerful. They're lessons. Lessons about justice, about accountability, about the human need to be heard. In their cracked corners and wedge-shaped letters, these tablets reveal not just the anger of long-dead traitors, but the soul of a civilization trying to hold itself together. The most immediate thing we learn is that complaining is not a modern invention. It's ancient, innate, embedded in what it means to live in a society. Wherever there are agreements, there will be broken ones. Wherever there are expectations, there will be disappointment. And wherever there are people, there will be people speaking up. The Sumerians didn't just complain, they formalized it. They turned it into a process. A clay tablet wasn't just a rant, it was a record. It was a call for correction. It had structure, tone, and consequence. And by doing this, they showed us something profound. That complaints, when done right, are not a breakdown of order, they're a maintenance of it. They're how communities check themselves, how standards are enforced, how trust is restored. We also learned that justice, even in its earliest forms, was rarely about dramatic punishments. It was about dialogue, about response. One tablet leads to another. A complaint prompts a reply. A disagreement prompts mediation. Ancient grievances often lived within a system, not just of rules, but of recognition. You wrote not just to vent, but to be acknowledged. And once you were acknowledged, there was a chance something might change. That's something we can still learn from today. In our world of online reviews and instantaneous feedback, it's easy to throw words into the void, to complain loudly, but forget why we're doing it. The Sumerians remind us, complaining is about resolution. It's about repair. They weren't trying to go viral, they were trying to make things right. Another lesson is the value of memory. Modern complaints often disappear, lost in digital noise or customer service queues. But in Sumer, a complaint was made of clay. It could be held, stored, read again. It became part of the official record. In doing so, it gave weight to personal experience. It turned emotion into evidence. And that gave ordinary people power, not through wealth or status, but through words. We can also learn something about language itself. These ancient complaints are full of restraint. No shouting, no exaggeration, just firm, precise language. The hurt was real, the disappointment sharp, but it was expressed through structure, through formality, through a kind of ethical clarity that made the message even stronger. And here's perhaps the biggest lesson of all. To complain is to care. If you didn't care, you wouldn't write. You wouldn't pay a scribe. You wouldn't risk attention or judgment. But when something matters, your dignity, your money, your trust, you speak. And in ancient Sumer, speaking meant writing. Writing meant pressing clay. And pressing clay meant your grievance became part of something bigger than yourself. That's a tradition we're still part of, whether we realize it or not. Every time we push for a refund, demand better service, or leave a review, not to shame, but to improve, we're stepping into a conversation that began thousands of years ago. A conversation about fairness, about standards, about accountability. It's humbling to think that while empires rose and fell, while languages changed and cities vanished, these small voices endured. Not kings, not generals, but ordinary people saying, this was not okay. And in that act, they gave us a roadmap, not just of trade and law, but of courage. Because to file a complaint is to believe in something, in fairness, in process, in the possibility that someone will listen and something will change. So what can we learn from ancient grievances? Everything. We learn that systems are built not just on power, but on participation. We learn that words matter, not just in the moment, but across centuries. And we learn that the oldest form of hope might be this, to write it down and trust that justice will follow. Let's be honest, there's something oddly satisfying about a well-crafted complaint. Not a scream into the void, not a passive-aggressive tweet, but a structured, poetic dismantling of someone's failure to meet expectations. The ancient Sumerians mastered this art, so much so that thousands of years later, their complaints are still being read, studied, and admired, not for their fury, but for their finesse. So, what if you wanted to write your own Sumerian-style complaint today? Not just for fun, but as an exercise in restraint, wit, and the power of formality. Let's break it down. No stylus or clay tablet required, just a steady hand, a sharp mind, and maybe a bit of ancient flair. Step 1. Open with context, not emotion. The Sumerians never began with, I'm so angry I could scream. They started with facts, clear, calm, and immediate. You must do the same. Begin with who you are, what the transaction was, and what the original agreement entailed. For example, I, the undersigned, entered into agreement with you, merchant of copper, to receive 1 mina of refined metal in exchange for silver already delivered. No adjectives, no opinions, just the setup. This gives your complaint a foundation. It tells the reader, this is not a rant, it is a record. Step 2. Detail the offense, calmly but specifically. Now you present the failure. The Sumerians were brilliant at this part. They didn't embellish. They itemized. That's your goal here. Describe exactly what went wrong in the same measured tone. Example, what I received, however, was neither refined nor suitable for trade. The ingots were chipped, tarnished, and weighed less than agreed. Notice the tone. Controlled, but damning. The insult is in the detail. No need for name-calling when the facts can embarrass your opponent more efficiently. Step 3. Introduce the emotional undercurrent. This is where Sumerians excelled, expressing disappointment with devastating calm. The power wasn't in rage, it was in dignity. Example, it is not expected that a man of your station would send goods of such quality. This does not reflect well upon your name. In other words, I'm not angry, I'm just disappointed, and that hurts more. Step 4. Reference prior trust or goodwill. Then twist the knife. Sumerian complaints often included something like, I have dealt with you before, or I expected better based on your previous behavior. This adds a moral sting. Example, in past dealings I have found you reliable. Thus, this outcome is doubly troubling, not just for the copper, but for the trust we had established. You're not just saying the product failed, you're saying the person failed. That hits harder. Step 5, make a clear demand, but with grace. Don't beg. Don't threaten. Just state what you want. This might be a refund, an apology, a replacement. Keep it clean. Example, I request, therefore, that proper copper be delivered in accordance with the agreement or restitution made equal to the value of the silver already exchanged. Sumerians didn't end their tablets with thanks in advance or hope you understand. They let the request stand on its own merit. Step 6, close with formality and fire. Your final line should restate your dignity, not with venom, but with weight. The kind that says, I took the time to write this, and that means something. Example, let this tablet serve not as an insult, but as a record, and may your name be remembered not for failure, but for how you correct it. You're not destroying the bridge, You're giving them one last chance to fix it, putting it all together. A modern Sumerian-style complaint might look something like this. To the merchant who trades under the name of Halor, I, Marcus, son of Elon, did agree with you upon the 12th day of the month to receive 4 amphorae of oil in return for silver given in full. What I received was neither pure nor in proper vessel. 2 amphorae were cracked, and the oil within sour and foul-smelling. The 3rd was short in measure, and the 4th did not arrive. Such conduct is not in keeping with the trade customs of this city, nor the standards of your previous dealings. I have praised your name in times past. It saddens me now to find it under question. I ask that proper oil be sent, or silver returned in full, lest this tablet find its way to others. Let it be known, I do not seek quarrel, only correction. Marcus, witness to the trade of men and gods alike. Is it dramatic? Yes. Is it beautiful? Absolutely. And it does what every good complaint should do. Name the wrong, preserve the dignity of the writer, and give the offender a clear opportunity to make it right. So go ahead, try it. Channel your inner nanny. Press your modern frustrations into structured prose. You don't need a kiln, just a little patience and a little salt. Because sometimes a well-written complaint is the most enduring art form of all. Imagining ancient customer support. Let's just admit it, at some point, we've all fantasized about writing the perfect email to customer support. One that is cutting yet courteous, frustrated but not frantic. We hope it gets read by a real human, taken seriously, and resolved promptly. Now imagine trying to do that in 1750 CE, without the internet, without a phone, without a chatbot giving you a ticket number you'll never hear from again. Just you, a clay tablet, and the hope that your words, pressed by a stylus and baked under the sun, might lead to action. It's a ridiculous thought, right? But let's run with it. What if the Sumerians had email? What if, instead of handing off tablets via dusty couriers, they logged into some Mesopotamian Gmail and let it all out? What would their customer service exchange look like? Dear Eon Asir, I hope this message finds you well. I am writing with deep regret and growing frustration regarding the shipment of copper you promised last week. In some ways, not much would change. Because as absurd as this idea sounds, there's a reason we keep returning to the story of Nani and Eon Asir. It feels modern. He complains like we do. He sets the scene, lists the facts, and ends with a classy version of, "I'm never doing business with you again." He doesn't use emojis or CC the gods, but his tone? It's practically corporate. That's the heart of it. The structure of the complaint hasn't changed all that much in 4,000 years. The tone, the pacing, the strategy, these are the tools of someone who's done this before, someone who knows what makes people listen. So, when we imagine a Sumerian email, we're not just projecting modern convenience onto the past. We're recognizing something universal in how people address injustice. Let's imagine the inbox interface of the ancient world. Subject: regarding the dishonorable copper received. Sender: Nani, son of Idensin. 2. Anasir, trader of Dilmun wares. Temple of Ningol, Trade Disputes Division, Body. Dear Sir, this is not the first time I have trusted you with silver and received insult in return. The copper delivered was unacceptable, not only of poor quality, but short in weight. Moreover, my servant, whom you know well, and who has never disrespected you, was treated with rudeness and forced to wait without cause. I demand restitution or return of silver by the end of this week's market. Failing that, I will escalate the matter to the temple's scribal court and let the gods judge between us. Respectfully, Nani. Sent from my clay tablet, please excuse any typos in the cuneiform. Now, flip the view. What does Eon Asir's outbox look like? Subject: regarding the dishonorable copper received. Sender: an Asir, merchant of the Gulf. To no one. This is between us. Body: Nani, as I told your servant, the copper is from Dilmun. All traders know its irregular shape. I do not inspect every ingot myself. If your men are displeased, they are welcome to shop elsewhere. I owe you nothing more. Good day, Eon Asir, archived. No follow-up planned. The fantasy is fun, but the insight is real. Email may have streamlined complaints, but it didn't invent them. What we do with keyboards, the Sumerians did with styluses. What we store in cloud drives, they preserved in temple archives. What we hope to resolve with customer service reps, they hope to settle with scribes and priests. And honestly, they might have been better at it. Their complaints were brief, but eloquent. factual, yet emotional. They didn't hide behind boilerplate language or automated signatures. They spoke clearly, owned their words, and, most importantly, they understood that a complaint wasn't just about fixing a problem. It was about making it known, making it real, making it part of the public memory. Today's email systems allow us to fire off thoughts in seconds, but Sumerian complaints took effort, time, intention, and maybe that's why they still resonate. They weren't just messages, they were monuments to dissatisfaction. And they tell us more about the emotional intelligence of ancient people than any epic poem or royal inscription ever could. So the next time you sit down to write a strongly worded email, pause for a moment and think like a Sumerian. Choose your words carefully. Keep your tone sharp, not shrill. Make sure your facts are clear. And remember, once you hit send, your message might outlive you. Because in the end, whether pressed in clay or typed in Arial 11, a good complaint is timeless. There's something oddly beautiful about the way the Sumerians complained. Not beautiful in the sense of dramatic flair or lyrical elegance, but in the precision, the control, and the quiet gravity of their words. These weren't just rants carved into clay. They were composed, measured, almost poetic. That's where things get interesting. Because when you read some of these ancient complaint tablets closely, especially the infamous letter from Nani to Eon Nasir, you start to ask, where does a complaint end and poetry begin? Is it possible that in the midst of anger, the Sumerians accidentally created art? Let's break this down. Sumerian complaint tablets weren't chaotic expressions of emotion. They followed structure. They had rhythm. They balanced statements of fact with layers of expectation, tone, and sometimes devastation. And while their content was often mundane, copper, grain, missing donkeys, the delivery was anything but. It was formal, precise, and eerily effective. Take this line as an example. You are not what you promised. It sounds like something from a breakup poem. It hits harder because it's understated. There's no screaming, no insult. Just 6 words that dismantle an entire relationship. It's the kind of sentence that stays with you. Not just because it's a complaint, but because it's a truth delivered with elegance. That's what Sumerian complaints teach us. That style matters. That form matters. That even when you're furious, how you say something shapes how it will be remembered. In modern terms, we're used to thinking of poetry as elevated, artistic, detached from daily life. But in ancient Mesopotamia, poetry and daily life weren't so far apart. Their epics were about gods and kings, yes, but their complaints were about values, justice, dignity. And in both, the weight of the words mattered more than the drama of the story. Think about it this way. If you're going to go through the effort of hiring a scribe, composing a tablet, and presenting it in a public space, you're not just writing a note. You're performing. You're crafting a statement that will live on, that others might hear read aloud, that might be cited in future disputes. That makes every sentence a line of public rhetoric, of social poetry. And in that sense, Sumerian complaint tablets become something more than documents. They become declarations, testimonies, a kind of everyday literature, born not from inspiration, but from necessity. It's in the phrasing, the balance, the restraint. You won't find metaphors or similes, but you will find cadence, the repetition of wrongs, the precision of complaint, the rising tension of a grievance laid bare. It reads like a monologue, one person speaking calmly but firmly, trying to right a wrong with nothing but words. And that's powerful. Even more powerful is the permanence. Poetry fades from memory, but these tablets were fired, preserved, buried, and thousands of years later, we're still reading them, still struck by their clarity, still wondering how so much force could live inside such modest slabs of clay. Today, we post online, we leave reviews, we draft angry emails. But how often do we choose our words like they'll be read in 4,000 years? How often do we structure our frustrations like they deserve to be remembered? The Sumerians did. And maybe that's why their complaints feel so different, so heavy, so literary. Because beneath the accusation is something older than paper, older than law. A human voice, shaped not by shouting, but by silence, breath, and pressure against wet clay. That's poetry, whether they meant it or not. So yes, when we ask if these complaints crossed into art, the answer might be absolutely. Not because they tried to be beautiful, but because they tried to be clear. Because they respected the act of writing. Because they trusted that language, used carefully, measured like silver, could move people, could correct wrongs, could live forever. In the end, a Sumerian complaint was not just a request for restitution. It was a performance, a protest, a poem written in clay. We live in a world saturated with noise. Ratings, reviews, emails, tweets, feedback forms. Everywhere we turn, someone is registering a complaint. Sometimes it feels like we're stuck in a loop of dissatisfaction, constantly pointing out what went wrong, who failed, or what fell short. And yet, the more we look at it, especially through the lens of Sumerian complaint tablets, the more it becomes clear this isn't new. This is ancient. This is human. Maybe, just maybe, we're not doing anything radically different from what people were doing 4,000 years ago. Maybe every one-star review, every strongly worded email to customer support, every note that left on a neighbor's door is part of a long, slow, evolving tradition. A tradition that began when someone like Nani pressed a reed into wet clay and said, in his own elegant way, "This is not okay." That's the core of it, the drive to be heard, to make frustration visible, to give disappointment shape. Complaining isn't just an outlet, it's a mirror, a way to measure what we value, what we expect, and how we think the world should work. Whether you're demanding better copper, faster shipping, or an apology, the underlying impulse is the same, to hold someone accountable to a promise. So, are we just continuing an ancient tradition? Yes, and proudly so. Because while the tools have changed, from clay tablets to digital keyboards, the purpose has not. Complaints are not noise, they're negotiation. They're the middle step between silence and revolution. The moment where someone says, "I still care enough to speak." What's even more remarkable is how similar our strategies remain. The structure of Sumerian complaints, the calm opening, the detailed breakdown of wrongs, the formal closing. Isn't that different from the modern professional email? The tone we adopt when we want to be taken seriously hasn't evolved all that much. We've traded styluses for spell check. The script is familiar, but the script is familiar. That's why Nani's tablet to Nasir went viral in our time. Not just because it was the oldest known complaint, but because it was instantly relatable. You didn't need to be an archaeologist to understand his frustration. You just needed to have ever ordered something and been disappointed. And that's the beauty of it. In a sea of lost kings and forgotten empires, the voice that endured wasn't royal. It was just real. And perhaps that's the deeper point. These tablets remind us that history isn't just about the great battles and mythic figures. It's about people. People with standards. People who expected better. People who were tired of getting the wrong thing and made sure someone knew about it. In a strange way, complaining is a form of hope. You only speak up when you believe someone might listen, when you think things can improve, when you're not ready to give up yet. That's what gives the Sumerian complaints their unexpected warmth. Beneath the annoyance is a desire to fix, to restore trust, to keep things working. And that brings us back to today. Maybe when we file a dispute, write a bad review, or give constructive criticism, we should remember we're part of something older than democracy, older than capitalism, older than most religions. We're part of a global, timeless tradition of humans trying to make their world just a little bit better, one complaint at a time. It's not cynical. It's not petty. It's deeply human. So the next time you hit submit on a feedback form or draft a message about a missing package, think of Nani. Think of scribes in hot, dusty cities, pressing grievances into clay with care and clarity. Think of temples where tablets were stored as records of fairness. And think of yourself, not as someone complaining, but as someone contributing to one of humanity's most enduring rituals. Because sometimes, to complain is not to tear something down. It's to say, this still matters, and I still care.